I'm giving you both the audio versions and the video versions because of a campus policy. I'm supposed to give you the videos, not the audios only. In all honesty, there's not a lot happening on the screen. Not only am I not moving very much, but you can't even see my lips move. So if you're a lip reader, that you're not helped much even. Unless you're really a good lip reader and you can see what my lips are doing under the mask. So I think you may be just fine listening to the audio if you want to review any of this. So let's go back to Luke, and I'm going to go, we talked about chapters 9 and 10, but I'm just going to draw on some themes here. Chapter 9, this is where the 12 are sent out, the 12 apostles that Jesus has chosen. And what's happening in this chapter thematically is that Jesus' identity and his role is changing, and so is that of his apostles. Because earlier, Jesus had been acting alone, for chapters 5 and chapter 7, or teaching alone, chapter 6. And it says the 12 were with him. That's chapter 8, verse 1. But what's happening now is, initially what was happening before in chapter 12 is that they were like apprentice workers working under Jesus' direction. And now they are sent out on their own, and they are given the responsibility of reporting back. Believe it or not, there are people who've done books on organization and management training who appeal to the example of Jesus as a trainer. Yeah, it's like, believe it or not, there are such books actually exist, because first he acts, and then he asks them to participate, and then he lets them do certain things while he observes them, and then finally he sends them out to act on their own, and they come back and report to him. So what you see is this increasing emphasis upon the agency of the apostles themselves as they go along. There's some surprises, as we'll see, because we not only have the 12 sent out, but in the next chapter, the 70 go out, and the 70 seem to be more successful than the 12. The 12 seem to have more trouble, and there's more information on the 70 than the 12, which is sort of counterintuitive. It doesn't, you'd expect the apostles to be exalted a little bit more. It doesn't really quite turn out that way. And in a certain sense, in chapter 9, the disciples are gaining power and authority. He gives them authority to preach the message of the kingdom, which involves the healing of the sick, the casting out of demons. Well, that's actually mentioned in the next chapter. But this is also the chapter at 9 where the confession is made for the first time by Peter that you are the Christ of God. Peter answers, verse 20, chapter 9, verse 20, you are the Christ of God. But then he goes on and speaks of the suffering he must undergo. So in a sense, it's almost as if Jesus is losing authority, or at the very least, you'd say the notion of power and authority that is being presented is not the worldly idea that would have existed in the Roman Empire, or for that matter, even among the Jews, because you think if the Christ is a ruler, then he would be dictating to others. He wouldn't be dictated to. He wouldn't have to suffer. And so he says in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 and 43, he says, whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And so that is the part of what I think I called before the upside down kingdom, the idea that this kingdom does not work according to normal human principles, in which and we saw that as early as Mary's statement that he would send the humble, he would exalt the humble, and then he would cast down rulers from their thrones. That's the theme of reversal, social reversal. Okay, so there's two sendings. There's the sending in chapter 9, sending in chapter 10, the sending of the 12, and the sending of the 70. According to traditional Jewish belief, there were 70 nations in the world, Gentile peoples, other than Israel. Now, obviously, we know there's a lot more than that if we count language groups. But 70 is a symbolic number. 70 is also the number of the quorum for the number that would have to convene for the Sanhedrin. And so it is a symbolic number of a fullness or completeness. And the 70 are sent out with the same ministry as the 12. They had to rely on God for protection, and 10:3 for provision. Chapter 10, verses 4 to 8, they would heal the sick. 10, chapter 9, preaching the kingdom. And they were to shake the dust off their feet when they were rejected. So basically, people had a choice to make. The messengers of the kingdom came, and you either had to receive them or you could reject them. And so there's a kind of sobering element to that. And of course, they come back and they report that the demons are subject to them in Jesus' name. Okay, we already talked about Mary and Martha last week. I sort of got off onto that, but that's a great theme in terms of this whole idea of the active life versus the contemplative life. That life is, what is the highest spiritual or religious ideal? Is it activity and service for others? Or is it a quiet meditation, reflection, and prayer in God's presence? And I don't know if you are aware of this, but there are certain religious orders, even today, that are purely contemplative. For instance, the Pink Sisters, who are here in St. Louis, if you want someone to pray for you, contact the Pink Sisters, because that's what they do. They pray, and they are an enclosed order, meaning they don't go out, they don't socialize. Obviously, there are women religious nuns, women in religious orders, as well as men in religious orders that are primarily out and serving. The Jesuit tradition was never as focused on the contemplative life as some of the others, because the Jesuits are not required to pray with one another. If you go to St. Louis Priory, the Benedictine monks there, they are supposed to show up periodically through the day to pray as a group. And that limits how far they can, they're kind of on a short tether. They can't simply go off. The Jesuits are, if you're a Jesuit priest, you're supposed to say Mass every day, but you can be out in the world. And so the Jesuits were more of a kind of they practiced contemplation, but in the context of serving in the world. They wanted to combine the contemplation and the practice. If you want to find the really traditional contemplative life, you'd find that in the Christian East, the Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy. There's a mountain in northeast Greece called Mount Athos, and there are thousands of monks that live there. No woman is allowed on the island, because this is strictly a male religious community with these thousands of monks. Of course, there are women's orders and Orthodoxy as well. But so anyway, that's kind of the Mary interpretation of Mary and Martha. Okay, in chapter 11, we have instructions on prayer, and we have growing conflicts that are emerging here. This is where we have the so-called Lord's Prayer, beginning of Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Or actually, Luke, it's a little bit simpler. Usually the Matthew version is what's prayed, but Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Some say this really should be called the disciples' prayer, because it isn't the prayer that the Lord or the Lord Jesus prayed, but the prayer that he taught them to pray. There are conflicts that emerge in this chapter when Jesus' authority is challenged as he casts out demons. There's an argument with the Pharisees. He casts out demons by Beelzebul, the chief of the demons. So they're basically arguing that he must have been in league with the devil in order to cast out demons. And he basically says this, that doesn't make any sense. If I were acting on the devil's authority, why would I be destroying the kingdom of the devil? That's what Jesus argued. And then he made a famous line. He said, a house divided cannot stand. Who else said that? Yeah, Abraham. And where did Lincoln say it? Do you know where? In Springfield, Illinois. That was the famous house divided lecture that he gave, or speech, I guess I should say. So that was basically that America could not remain. He said it will either be all a slave nation or we will abolish slavery. It will be because a house divided against itself shall not stand. Jesus said that first in relation to, in his argument with the Pharisees. This is one of the episodes, chapter 11, where he is invited into the home of a Pharisee to share a meal together. Look at chapter 7, chapter 11, and chapter 14. There are references in all three chapters to dining with the Pharisees. So here's a question, and we'll get into this when we look more at the background to these gospels that we're reading. But why did the Pharisees spend all this time dining with one another? Does anyone know what their custom was, or their outlook? What about, how about this? Do you know the word kosher? What does the word kosher mean? Okay, means acceptable. That's sort of an extended meaning. The original meaning of, if you say to a Jewish person, you point to something, you say that's kosher. What are you actually saying? Anybody online? No? Kosher?
I'm not exactly sure, but isn't it like a certain way that the food is prepared?
Yes, it does relate to the preparation of the food. There were foods, it's not exactly blessed, not like, because otherwise we could, like, you could just say a prayer over anything. You could say a prayer over a food and it would be blessed at that point, like blessing your food. There are certain foods that were forbidden to the Jews. Most famously, perhaps, is pork. A Jewish person who follows the Jewish law will never eat pork. Shellfish are not allowed. There are certain later interpretations, and this is kind of obscure, but that meat and milk products were not put together. So pepperoni pizza would not be kosher because you'd have the cheese on top, which is a milk product with the meat product. But that was a later further refinement. But there's certain things, if you look in the book of Leviticus in the Bible, that were strictly forbidden. Now, the attitude of the Pharisees, because they were like super heroic in their dedication to the law, was that they thought the ordinary Jews were really not very strict. And it was like maybe they would invite a Gentile friend over for dinner and they would have some questionable food and for the Pharisees, once a piece of pork like touched a vessel, they would break the vessel. This is still true today. If you're an Orthodox Jew, there's an Orthodox Jewish community, a strict Hasidic community in University City. If you drive on, let's see, I guess on, what is it, Delmar Avenue on early Saturday morning, you may see some of the members of the Hasidic community that are walking to synagogue at that time because they won't drive on the Sabbath day. So strict observers of Sabbath, strict observers of dietary law. If I really don't know if you're really strict, I don't want to eat in your house because I might be contaminated. And so what happened is the Pharisees, in effect, became like a dining club. They would only dine with one another because they really weren't sure about most of like what they thought were the questionable Jews. They were so strict that anyone who wasn't as strict as they were, they tended to look down upon. The fact that Jesus is invited in with them again, it shows that they kind of thought of him as like a fellow strict observer of Jewish law. It's people, they see the arguments that going on between Jesus and the Pharisees. And the other thing they don't understand is that the Pharisees argued among themselves. It's like if you got 3 or 4 Pharisees together, you'd probably have 30 or 40 different opinions. They were notorious for the depth and the intensity of their debates among themselves. And so when they debate Jesus, that's not because they rejected him, because they thought he was one of them, in effect. It's almost like accepting him. If I argue with you, then you're part of the club. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd think, right? So the Pharisees were known for their, if they thought that he was just beyond the pale completely, they would not have even talked to him. They certainly wouldn't have been inviting him into the home. So they're fascinated by Jesus because he's so hard to pin down, you see, because on the one hand, he's a faith, he knows the Torah amazingly well. He's following the Torah, but he says these extraordinary things like the healing on the Sabbath day. It is lawful to do good and not ill on the Sabbath day. He uses the example, if your child falls into the well, would you let them drown? And then he uses the example, I've healed this person. This is like an emergency situation he's saying. And then he says that he says, it is not man who was made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. And so it was a more humanizing, humanistic way of understanding the law, that the law existed for human welfare. And it was not to be interpreted so strictly that, or in such a way that it would exclude the concern for the welfare of people. And this actually, he's drawing, the book of Deuteronomy says some similar things about how the law is adapted. That, if you're harvesting according to the book of Deuteronomy in your land, you're to leave some of the crop unharvested for the poor. This was the ancient form of welfare. It wasn't just a giveaway, because those who were poor, they would have to come and they would have to work at the harvest. So it almost was a way of giving them some food in a way that would preserve their dignity at the same time. So Jesus' relationship to the Pharisee, I mean, on the one hand, he's saying, woe to you, Pharisees. I mean, he's saying some very, very strict things to them. And it certainly seems that after chapter 11, the relationship begins to deteriorate from that point on. But he nonetheless is still being invited, as I mentioned, in to dine with them. And so he was encountering them even in an intimate setting. Why is he in conflict with them? Well, on some level, maybe he had to be in conflict with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were the group in ancient Israel. There were actually others. There were the Essenes. We'll talk about this when we read my book, Familiar Stranger, and we look at the background. But the Essenes, Essenes, they were the ones that formed the Dead Sea, that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were a separate community, more separatists who were seeking to practice the law out all by themselves in the desert. And they'd kind of broken away from the whole group in Jerusalem, thinking that they weren't really strict. And then there were the Sadducees, and they were Jews that in some ways were more liberal on certain of their theological views, and they also collaborated with the Romans. When Jesus is betrayed, it's not by the Pharisees, although some of the Pharisees may have wanted him to be punished or put out in some way. But the Sadducees are the ones who control the high priestly office, and they are collaborating with the Romans. And then there was a third group, the Zealots. They were the political revolutionaries. Barabbas, who was released in place of Jesus, he may very well have been a zealot. We don't know for sure, but some of them called them the dagger men. They would go into the crowd and have a dagger under their cloak, and they would stab a Roman soldier, and then they would disappear into the crowd again. It was like a guerrilla movement. And ultimately, their voices become stronger and stronger up to the point of about in the 60s, up to the late 60s, when the Jewish war takes place, and that's when the whole of the Jewish people rebel against the rule of Rome, and then they're crushed. They're finally put down in the year 70 AD. So the Pharisees are one of these four groups. Again, it's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. But the Pharisees are the ones that are the best known interpreters of the law. And in effect, Jesus has to challenge them and their interpretation of the law in order to present his own interpretation. That is more humanistic, it's more centered on human welfare and less on a rigid application of the law that ignores ignores human welfare. He says in Matthew 23:2, he says, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. In other words, they appealed to the Old Testament law of Moses, and they interpreted this in a very strict way. He says, at one point, he says, you tithe your mint and dill and cumin, meaning that imagine if you're going to salt your food, that you take 1 grain of salt and put it aside as a tithe for every 9 grains of salt you put into your food. That's pretty particular, right? He's saying, you're so strict, he said, that you even tithe the salt and the spices that you're using. He said, but you devour widows' houses. Now, that's a kind of obscure statement, but what he meant was that they had tricky legal means that they were using to defraud people of their property. They were very clever about it. They had this practice called korban. This is mentioned in the book of Matthew. Korban meant dedicated. And they were advised, there were young people that did not want to support their parents when they got older. I mean, in that day, there was no Social Security, right? And no 401c or no 401k, program or money for retirement. So people relied on their children to support them when they got older. So they would come to the Pharisee. The Pharisee would declare their property and all their possessions to be korban. And that meant that the person living in the property could still use it for themselves, but they weren't obligated to share any of it with anyone else, even with their own parents. And Jesus, he called them out on that. He called it the Pharisees. He said, Scripture says, honor your father and your mother, and you found a way to avoid the obligation, the holy obligation of children to provide for their parents. And then he said, you do many such things as these. So one of the things that Jesus is getting at is, and this is pretty pertinent today, you think about legal tricks that people use to gain possession of things that they should not be able to take from other people. This was a practice that was going on even in the first century. So Jesus is pointing not only to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of the law. It was always intended for human welfare and for human good, and not to be used as a trick to get to have a one-upsmanship, over other people. Okay, then chapter 12. There are warnings here about hypocrisy and greed and complacency. What is a hypocrite? A hypocrite is a play actor. It's someone who pretends to be something that they're not. And so this was his accusation. The Pharisees pretend to be holy, they pretend to be righteous, but they actually have aims. They have aims that they're pursuing. They have an agenda they're pursuing that they're not acknowledging. And so the conflict seems to be ramping up in chapters 11 and chapter 12. He said at one point that in chapter 16, verse 14, the Pharisees were lovers of money. So he accuses them of being greedy. Essentially, in chapter 12, we could think in terms of three basic warnings. There's a warning about hypocrisy, and there's a warning about greed, secondly, and the third is a warning about complacency. And if you take these and flip them upside down, what he's basically saying is that he wants his followers to be characterized by the opposite of all these things: sincerity, generosity with their wealth, and a kind of alertness or preparedness. And so the basic values that were driving this first century society that are still with us today: the desire for pleasure, eat, drink, and be merry. There's a story in chapter 12 about the wise fool. The rich fool, I meant to say. This is in chapter 12, verse 16. And this is a man who has a very productive land. He said, I don't even have enough room to store my crops. He said, this is what I will do. He says, I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. If you look at that text, the very first thing you notice is the word I. I count like 6 times the word I. So this is a very self-preoccupied person. And what Jesus says to him, he said, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, meaning that he was going to die that night, didn't know it. And now who will own what you have prepared? And then his final comment, he says, so is the man who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So there's a call to a spirit of an ethic of generosity and of giving to others. So the desire for pleasure, for wealth, also the desire for security. There are a number of references here to anxiety. And in this passage, as in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, he basically argues, don't put your trust in money. Money is not going to give you a sense of security. And actually having more money can actually mean that you have more to worry about. There are stories from the great stock market crash in the 1920s about people who had $10 million and they only had, at the end of when the stock market began to crash, they ended up with only $2 million. And so they jumped out the 10th floor of the building and killed themselves. So people with $2 million to their name felt poor because they used to have $10 million. So, but it's all a relative thing, like who's wealthy and who's not wealthy. And they maybe were ashamed to face the other stockbrokers who had not lost their money. And that ties into the whole idea of social prestige and approval that generally comes to the wealthy. Wealthy people are honored, The person who works at the 7-Eleven as a cashier who wins the lottery and suddenly has $10 million. Everyone wants to be that person's friend. And people start talking about how wise that person is and how smart they were, and actually they just happened to buy the right lotto ticket. So wealth confers maybe the illusion of wisdom and skill and knowledge, and certainly conveys social prestige. So Jesus is pushing back against a scale of values in which money makes one person more valuable than another person. In chapter 13, there's a warning here on repentance. There's a Sabbath day healing, and there is a lamentation over Jerusalem. It's a little harder to see a key theme. It seems to be going in a number of different directions. There are people that who die because Pilate had slaughtered them. It says their blood was shed with their sacrifices. We're not sure exactly what this was, and there's also he mentions the episode of the tower in Siloam that fell. This is chapter 13, verses 4. He said, were they worse culprits than anyone else? You know, sometimes when people hear of a disaster that's happened, the first reaction is, wow, I'm glad it didn't happen to me or somebody I know. And the second thing is, wow, maybe that person, below the surface, sometimes they're thinking, well, that person must have been really evil because they, you know, bad things don't happen to good people. You know, and Jesus is challenging that assumption here. In the book of Job is suffering, and his friends are basically saying, okay, you're really suffering, Job. What did you do? What even did you commit adultery? Did you rob your workers? Did not pay them? What did you do wrong? Did you commit idolatry secretly, late at night, worship an idol? The assumption is bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. If bad things are happening to you, then you must be bad. So Jesus is challenging that, and he basically says we all must repent. And he uses a parable of the fig tree that had been planting and wasn't bearing fruit. And he looks, for 3 years I've been looking for fruit. If there's no fruit on the tree 3 years in a row, it probably means the tree is dead. There's no sign of life. So he says, give it another year. If it doesn't bear fruit, cut it down. And that's a sobering story about the call to repentance. Bearing fruit is meaning producing a good outcome in one's own life that shows one's own moral and spiritual life being manifest. Okay, chapter 14. If there's a theme here, it has to do with the difficulty of entering into a challenge of entering into the kingdom of God. There is a healing on the Sabbath. That he also tells a story about the feast where people are invited, and people want to sit in the place of honor. In that ancient culture, which is very hierarchical, there were places of honor and there were places of dishonor. I got invited to a banquet at the Hotel Frontenac, and I didn't sit in the first table, but I sat in the second or third table of the 400 or 500 people. So I was a semi-honored person. We have the same thing today, right? I mean, there are places that, you know, if a very distinguished person gets invited to St. Louis University, they're not going to be invited to the university and just hang out with one of us in one of the classrooms, right? They're going to be seated in a place of honor, and, you know, president of university, Pastello, is going to be there, maybe some of the trustees, or look at the way that graduations are done, right? You know, I get to process in wearing my robe, but I don't get to sit up on the platform in front. That's for the trustees. Maybe if I donated $1 million after I retire, and I don't have $1 million to give to SLU, but if I gave $1 million, maybe I could have a building named after me. You know, ancient cultures were even more hierarchical in many ways than our own in terms of distinction. And so Jesus says, when you go to the banquet, don't sit in the most distinguished place. He said, lest someone more distinguished than yourself come along, and then the host have to say, sorry, we need to move you out of this place and go. And then he says, then you go sit in the last place, go in shame, the walk of shame from the distinguished place down to the lower place. He said, instead sit in the lower place, and then the host will come along and see you sitting and say, wait a second, no, and you will be advanced in the sight of all. And so basically it's a kind of a message about this principle of humility, and that the true promotion isn't self-promotion, but it comes from God. So that's kind of contrary to our culture too, because we do have a self-promotional culture. I'm thinking of some of the online culture we have today. You know, everyone's trying to get clicks, right, or number of hits on their web page, whatever it might be. So the story of the slighted invitation in chapter 14. This is the great that the God is like the person that throws a great banquet, and he wants his banquet to be full, and he sends out invitations, and people start making excuses as to why they can't come. Okay, so I'm in chapter 14 in the middle of the chapter. First one says, I bought a piece of land and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused. Now think about that. Is that a good excuse? I bought some land and I have to look at it. Think about that for a second. Did this person buy the land without having seen the land? No. So this is like a made up excuse, right? Yeah, I need to look at the land that I just bought. And another one says, I bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. So I just bought a new car and I need to drive it for a while. Not a great excuse, right? And how about this? I married a wife and for that reason I cannot come. Well, that's at least a somewhat better reason, right? Newly married. And the master of the feast says, go out and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. Okay, like many of the parables of Jesus, there are a lot of different dimensions to this. Anyone have an idea as to what the application of this might be? Invitation to come to the feast, and some who are refusing, and yet others are just taken off the road to come into the feast. Think about that.
Maybe like those who are like taking the time to go to the feast and like reserving the time for that are like more compelled to actually listen and understand that that's part of the thing.
Okay, the one, so those who are, so you're saying that those
who like make the time and effort to like
okay.
These people aren't actually like they're not actually putting in the energy, obviously, but like I don't know.
Okay, there's some distinction. There's something different about the character of the ones that are saying yes to the invitation and those who are not. So in the mindset of these first century Jews, who would have been the people most worthy to go to the feast? If you think of God as the one who's throwing the feast, who would have been most worthy, most expected at the feast? Well, that's where we get, but in ancient Jewish society, well, first of all, the Jewish people would be the first in line, and maybe particularly faithful Jews, Pharisees, others like them, who are strict Jews. And so the story of the slighted invitation is pushing away in the opposite direction, saying those who respond to the invitation are maybe not the ones that you would expect to. And instead, it is the quote unquote unwashed multitude that are responding. What we find throughout the Gospels is that there were multitudes of people that loved to hear Jesus speak. While the leaders got very upset, but the multitudes listened to him. So it's an inversion thing. So it's an inversion of the ins and the outs. The ins, the people who are on the in and advanced and elite seem to be not responding, and it is those who are kind of in the highways and the byways that do respond to Jesus' message. And there may be a message here about Jews and Gentiles too, and this comes up. It's sort of under the surface here, and this is the really thing that would have been very offensive. Remember the sermon on chapter 4 where he speaks of how Elijah went to the widow of Zarephath, the Gentile woman, and stayed with her because the true faith was being persecuted in Israel under King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. So he's pointing like the Gentiles actually seemed to be more religious than the Jews were. That's not what the Jewish people wanted to hear, because they thought of themselves, we are faithful to God, we worship the true God, they're idolaters. How could they be more righteous than we are? How could they be more religious than we are? And so this parable is pushing in a little bit different direction on that point. Okay, so there's more conflict with the Pharisees that's emerging here at this point. They are grumbling at chapter 15. The tax gatherers and the sinners, as Jesus is dining with them. We have in chapter 15 one of the most famous stories in the entirety of the Bible. And this is the story of a father and the two sons. So let's talk about that for a second. What is the basic plot line here of the story of the prodigal son? What happens? To summarize? Yeah.
Well, the younger son asks his dad for his share of the land,
Mm-hmm.
the fortune, and goes off and spends it irresponsibly. Then, while the older son is like working for the dad still, and then he comes back and he wants, because he's like poor and homeless now, and so he wants to work for the dad in order to like regain a living, but the dad celebrates him.
Okay, good. That's very good. Thank you. That was a good short summary. So we have three main characters, a father and two sons. The younger son, who ends up the renegade, the rebel, he comes to the father and says, "Give me the share of my inheritance that is due to me." Now, in that culture at that day, to ask for your inheritance before your fathers died, that was like saying, "You are as good as, I don't care whether you live or die. I just want the money." And the father, now, because he was a younger son, he would have, according to Jewish law, been entitled to about a third if there were two sons. So the older brother would have gotten 2/3, the younger son about 1/3. So it would have been a substantial amount of money. So he goes off and it says he spent his money in riotous living. And there's a little bit of an explanation of that later when the older son, who's indignant once he comes back, says that he spent your money on prostitutes. So he's living a life according to the fleshly desire, right? And so the older brother continues to serve under the father's direction, and the father responds in the most remarkable way, unexpected way. You'd think at the very least, when this renegade, this reprobate son comes back, that he would be put on kind of probation. The father would be kind of arms crossed. Okay, you can stay on the property, but I'm going to keep my eye on you for a few months. Instead, it says when the father saw him from a distance, he ran off to him. Now, in ancient culture, a respected older man never ran. Running was like what children do. So he runs to him. So he must have grabbed his robes up and run after. And actually, it says he saw him from afar off, and it's been pointed out he must have had his eye on the road to even know that he was coming back. So he runs to him, and then he says he has a little speech presented that he's already prepared in advance, because he said, "When I go back to my father, I'm going to say, Father," this is verse 18, chapter 15, verse 8. Chapter 15, verse 8. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men." And he starts into his speech. And what's interesting, he doesn't get through the speech. He says, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." And the father interrupts him before he says, "Make me as one of your hired men." So he doesn't get through his speech. He said, "Quickly bring the best robe, the ring on his hand, the sandals to put on his feet. Let's bring the fatted calf." This is the animal that was set aside. It's like saying we're going to go to the most expensive restaurant in town and have a lavish meal in celebration of the fact that you've come back. And the elder son, now can anyone identify with the elder son in this situation? Some of you maybe? I think some of us, sometimes we feel like we're an elder son. Sometimes we feel like we're a younger son. I think we can all identify maybe in some way with both of them. But the older son, he doesn't know what's going on. He's been working all day, and he comes back and he sees a big celebration. And then he hears, "Oh, this is for your younger brother who's come back." And he doesn't want to join in. And what's interesting is that there's an exchange then between the father and the son. And he says he was angry. He says, look, for so many years I've been serving you, says to his father. I've never neglected a command of yours, and yet you've never given me a kid that I might be merry with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, the father says, my child, you've always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to be merry and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. So what would this apply in the situation of Jesus, do you think? What does it mean? What's the meaning in the first century context? I think of what we've already been talking about in the Gospel of Luke. Anyone have any idea online?
I do.
Yeah.
I think that this parable just talks about that no matter, like what wrong you do, like in the kingdom of God, as long as you always come back to God, that he will always accept you for who you are.
Okay. Okay, so it's something about God's mercy. He's the God of the second chance, you might say, or maybe the third or fourth chance in some cases.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, do you think the elder son and the younger son are to be identified as any particular social group alive in Jesus' day? The beginning of the chapter, the tax gatherers and sinners are coming to Jesus to hear him, and the Pharisees are grumbling. So if you look at the beginning of the chapter, that's a pretty big clue here that this parable is a very clever way of making a point indirectly about the mercy of God. The Pharisees, well, first of all, the attitude of the father in the parable, who seems to be in a picture of a loving and a forgiving God, that's not the attitude of the Pharisees. If you're a Pharisee, your attitude, these people who've gone off the track, they've broken the Jewish law, forget about them, put them out of your mind, they're cannon fodder or whatever you want to, it's like they don't deserve any consideration. And so this is a story that's a direct challenge to that sort of attitude of just writing off certain people. These are bad people. They don't deserve forgiveness. And I was asked to speak on this text once, and my point was that the point I made, I don't know if you agree with this. This is more interpretive, but I think all of us could be elder brothers or younger brothers, depending on the company you put us in to, If we get around really, really righteous, strict people, we could all feel like we're the younger brother, right? We could look at them and say, hey, man, show me a little mercy, Like, look, I haven't lived my life that strictly, but I'm not, it's not like I'm a super criminal. Now you put us in a different company around a bunch of real rebels and renegades, right? And suddenly we turn into an older brother. We look at those people and say, hey, man, they should get their act together. Look at the terrible choices they're making. I don't know. Turn on the Jerry Springer show. I don't know, is that still on? It's like, what, everyone feels like an older brother when they watch that program, right? Because these family members like strike, a cat fight between two sisters on stage, or and there's a man and two women, and the women are fighting, this kind of thing. It's almost designed to make you feel morally superior to the people who are there. So this is an interesting parable that is very famous, justly famous. The details all seem to add up to to make a very powerful point about the mercy of God. Okay, then let's look at these next few chapters and see if we can get through. Okay, the chapter 16. There's a parable of the unrighteous steward and the story of the Lazarus and the rich man. And they're both kind of well-known stories. The first one is considered one of the strangest parables because it's a story about a guy who was an embezzler. And he's been squandering the possessions. He's a household steward. This is like the vice president of the company, and they find out he's taking money for himself, and he knows he's going to get fired. So he calls in the people that owe money, and he says, "You owe me 100, then just give me 50 instead." So he like reduces the amount they have to pay back. And this is to make friends for himself after he's fired. And the striking thing is that this very corrupt character, Jesus said, when the master found out, he praised the unrighteous steward because he had acted shrewdly. So even though he lost money through this guy, the guy says, "And you are a smart one." And then he says, "For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light." And then this strange statement, "Make friends for yourself by means of the mammon or wealth of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwelling." There's a lot of discussion about what this is really saying, but it's almost like Jesus is saying, if there is such a thing as real spiritual wealth, then you should be as shrewd in seeking that as the children of this age are in seeking material wealth. There are people to get wealthy in this world that will work 16 hours a day. They'll be incredibly diligent. They'll even undercut, double cross friends, do all kinds of things, whatever it takes, because they're so single-minded about advancing themselves in a material sense. So Jesus seems to be saying there is a kind of spiritual equivalent of this, where we realize what real wealth is, that doesn't simply exist in material things. And then the next part also deals with wealth, and this is where you have the poor man who's daily begging for money, and this is a rich man. He isn't given a name. He's called Dives. That just means rich in Latin, but Dives and Lazarus. He habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, gaily lived in splendor every day. So every day is a party, a new dinner party, a new chef comes over at the house, a big outdoor event like this, and he doesn't even notice Lazarus, who's begging. Just says Lazarus just wanted some crumbs from the table of this rich man to be fed to him. And so what happens? Reversal, because in the life beyond, Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom, which seems to be like a picture of heaven, and the rich man is in hell. And it says that he sees Lazarus and he says, "Go and warn my brothers, thus they come to this place." Abraham says, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead." So this is another interesting text, but it deals with the judgment, the afterlife, the reversal to occur. Okay, chapter 17, just briefly, there are kingdom instructions here on the coming of God's kingdom. The danger of stumbling blocks, the need for forgiveness. There's a story of the healing of the lepers, and there are 10 who are healed, but only one comes back to give thanks, and it was the Samaritan. It's almost like the story of the Good Samaritan earlier. Okay, and let's see, in chapter 18, there is this question about access to God's kingdom. Who is welcomed into the kingdom? It is those who are persistent. Jesus gives a story about a widow who needs legal protection, has some legal opponent, and there is an unjust judge, says, who did not fear God, did not respect man. And the widow ultimately prevails, not really because she's in the right, because apparently she had the legal right to win this case, but because she kept hounding the judge so often. And so the judge finally says, he says, "Even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she wear me out." The Greek word says wear out. It says hit me under the eyes, what it literally says. It's a figure of speech, but it's like this woman would not give him any rest. And so what Jesus says is this is the way you should be praying to the Father in heaven for justice, is to continually cry out to him. And so God welcomes those who are persistent, He welcomes also those who are humble rather than self-righteous. This is a chapter that also talks about the tax gatherer and the Pharisee who go to pray in the temple. And the tax gatherer will not even raise his eyes to God. He says, "Be merciful to me, a sinner." This is verse 13. The Pharisee prays. He said, "God," the first thing he says, "I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax gatherer." So while he's praying, he's like accusing this other person. And then he says, "I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get." You get the point here? His prayer was a form of, it wasn't really even a prayer. It was like a self-declaration. His prayer was filled with declarations of how wonderful he was, how righteous he was. You know, how lucky God was to have someone like him on God's side. And so Jesus says, it's not the Pharisee, but it is the tax gatherer, or publican, to use the traditional language, who went home justified with God. So it is the attitude of not of self-righteousness, but of humility that wins favor with God. Okay, then in chapter 19, Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, the so-called triumphal entry passage. This is if there is a meter of Jesus' popularity, this is the peak moment, peak Jesus popularity, because there's conflict that emerges with the leaders, and then there's a plot against Jesus. And we know that within only a week after this, there were a multitude of people that cried for Jesus to be crucified. And so this is one of the great paradoxes in the Gospels, is how could Jesus be welcomed by everyone clapping and applauding as he comes into Jerusalem, and then a week later, it seems been rejected, so by either the whole city or a large number of those in the city at that point. Jesus, when he sees Jerusalem, it says that he wept over the city. And that's very striking because he sees beyond the immediate situation. He's not weeping for himself, but in this chapter, he begins to speak of the things that lie ahead, the future events, and begins to forecast. Well, it's particularly in chapter 21, I think, chapter 21. But in Matthew, it speaks of him weeping over Jerusalem when he sees it. He is aware of the future judgment that is coming. The Roman war, this is happening in the 60s AD, so about 64 to about 70 AD, and he sees that not only that he will be rejected by the people, but he foresees that the city will rise up in rebellion against Rome, and it will endure tremendous suffering. We know that according to Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, maybe 1 million Jews died in the vicinity of Jerusalem. And there was cannibalism in the city because there was a famine. The siege went on for so long. So Jesus foresees something. At this moment that could have been triumph, Jesus sees something else. And he tells the story of a man who was to receive a kingdom and then goes away and returns. So one of the famous lines in here is, the multitudes are crying out in celebration of Jesus. By the way, if you are someone who attends church services, you know Palm Sunday is the time in the liturgical calendar that the triumphal entry is celebrated. And some churches hand out palm branches today as a sort of symbol of this. So they're crying out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And then the Pharisees are the spoil sports, you know, the killjoys. They say, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And Jesus says in verse 40, "I tell you, if these," meaning the disciples, "become silent, the stones will cry out." So one of these enigmatic sayings, but kind of a vivid saying. Okay, then chapter 20, we have debates of the Jewish leaders with Jesus at the temple. And let's just say you probably didn't want to debate Jesus. Maybe they didn't realize that they shouldn't get into a debate. According to the rules of the debate, in rabbinical discussions, if you ask a question of someone else, they have the right to question you back. That's the way it worked. And so they ask him a question, he asks a question back, and they want to get Jesus into trouble. right? They want to get him in trouble. With who? Well, especially with the Romans. We want the Romans to think that Jesus is a rebel in some way against Roman authority. So they ask him, by what authority are you doing these things? Okay, that's in chapter 20, verse 3. So he answers it, he responds, he says, oh, first I have a question for you. Jesus says, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? And here's the interesting thing. When the Jewish leaders were discussing this, they didn't talk about what was true or not. They wanted to talk about what was prudent or not, what would be an acceptable. They were more concerned with spin and PR than they were with truth. And says they got reason among themselves. So they're off by themselves and they're saying, we don't know what to say, because if we say that John the Baptist was sent from heaven, then he's going to ask us, why didn't you believe him? And if we say, no, he was not from heaven, then the people will stone us, because John the Baptist was very popular with the people. So they just said, well, we don't know. And Jesus said, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. So what's the point here? It seems to be that Jesus is saying, if you don't accept the predecessor, the forerunner, John, and recognize him, then you're not going to recognize me as well. He's saying John was the lesser light. He's basically implying I'm the greater light. And if you rejected the lesser light, you're going to reject me too. So he asked them his own question to kind of pin them down. And it turns out they wouldn't commit themselves regarding John the Baptist. There's this famous parable of the vineyard, and there's a lot that is implied there about the owner of the vineyard sends his son, and they mistreat the son. The people who are tenants, they are renters on the land, and the judgment comes upon those who are renting, these renters, because they've mistreated the son of the owner. And that is kind of reflecting the rejection of Jesus that's about to take place. And then the famous episode, the denarius. The denarius was a Jewish coin that had the image of Caesar on it. And they come to Jesus. It says they came to him hypocritically. It was trickery, it says. They said, oh, teacher, we know that you teach correctly. Well, they were just buttering him up at that point. He said, you're not partial to any, you teach the way of God and truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And they thought they had him caught, because the strict Orthodox Jews, they didn't want to even pick up a denarius because it had the image of Caesar on it. It was considered an idol or an image because it had Caesar's image, and Caesar was considered a god. You see, if you're really a strict Jew, you don't want anything to do with idolatry. You can't even pick up a denarius. You can't have anything to do with it. So they thought, but if Jesus says, no, we can't use that coin, we can't engage in that Jewish coinage, then we'll ensure that the Romans look unfavorably at Jesus. You follow? So Jesus says, show me a denarius. So they show him a coin, and he says, whose head and inscription does it have? They say, Caesar's, and they're waiting for the answer. He said, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And it says, and they marveled at this answer, because he had just sidestepped their whole question. You're carrying around Caesar's coins, which, I mean, if you're going to be part of Caesar's realm, you have to do things Caesar's ways. He says, but God has his own requirements. So he had a very interesting answer. This whole question about the resurrection, the woman that was married to the 7 brothers, it's like this, like stump the professor type of question, you know? And what's funny is the people asking us, the Sadducees didn't even believe in the resurrection, but they came up with this absurd story, and he basically turns it on them, and he says, but kind of like implying, well, you don't believe in the resurrection, but maybe you should think again. So, okay, then in chapter 21, we get into the story of the coming siege in Jerusalem. Some of what's in chapter 21 seems to relate to the end of the age, the end of the age, and so that seems like there is the end of the catastrophe Jerusalem that is foreshadowing some greater global event in which he said the sun and the moon and stars will be affected in some way. And then he talks about the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the sky, coming in on clouds with great power and glory. And so this is a chapter that some would apply to the so-called end times, the ending of the age, end of the world, the apocalypse, and so on. Chapter 22 and chapter 23 recount both the betrayal of Jesus, his arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion. And maybe one of the there's an awful lot in that chapter, but one of the things that's probably best known here is the story of the thieves on the cross. And this is in chapter 23, verse 39. One of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." This little episode is only in the Gospel of Luke. The other one said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation?" He says, "And we indeed justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, this is a very interesting episode because this thief seems to recognize the justice of the sentence on which he is that he's under. He recognizes that Jesus is innocent. And beyond that, when he says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom," that's almost a confession of faith, because Jesus is another criminal dying nailed to a piece of wood. And so somehow he has the faith to see beyond the immediate situation, see that Jesus is going to be vindicated. So it's a tremendous statement of faith. And Jesus promises him that the thief, who believes in him at the very last moment of his own life, that he would be with him in paradise. So that's often cited as an example of a kind of a deathbed conversion or last-minute conversion. So after Jesus is died and buried, chapter 24 is the chapter, Luke's account of the resurrection, which includes something that isn't in the other four Gospels, and this is the story of the Emmaus Road. These two disciples that are walking along. One is named Cleopas. The other one is not named. There's a theory that maybe this was Cleopas's wife. We don't really know. Could have been a male companion. Could have been his wife. And this stranger walks up to them and says, "What are you talking about?" This is in verse 17. "What are you talking about when you're walking?" And Cleopas says, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem unaware of the things which have happened?" And he said, "What things?" So Jesus is literally playing dumb here. It's like, as we find out later, the stranger is Jesus. Said, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, the prophet mighty indeed." They call him prophet, not Christ, but he was a prophet. "And how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to the sentence of death and crucified him." But look at verse 21. "But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel." Past tense, meaning we did have this hope. Our hope is gone at this point. And it's the third day since these things happened. But then some women among us amazed us when they were at his tomb. They did not find his body, but they had a vision of angels. So they've already heard, Cleopas has already heard this rumor. Something has happened. The body's not there. And then Jesus speaks a kind of word of rebuke. "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" It says, "In beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures." So Jesus began to go through the Hebrew Bible and point to all the passages that anticipated his coming. Wouldn't you have liked to have been in that session with Rabbi Jesus to hear what he said? But it's possible that some of the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible that we find in Acts of the Apostles, the early Christian preaching, Peter and Paul, was actually rooted in things that Jesus said to Cleopas. I assume that Cleopas shared this with the 12 apostles. And so he breaks the bread. They invite him to come in for the night, breaks the bread, and this is their eyes were open. They recognized him. And then later, the other apostles are incorporated into the story. They have the encounter with Jesus. And the chapter ends that repentance for forgiveness of sin should be proclaimed to all the nations. So there is a commissioning of the apostles to go out and preach. That's the way that Matthew ends this gospel, with the commission to go out and preach. But in Luke, it tells them to wait, or tarry, the traditional translation, to wait. Let's see. stay in the city until you're clothed with power from on high. That's verse 39. And so that is anticipating the moment of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit would fall on the apostles. Hey, we've come all the way through. So, okay, so we have a few minutes left. As you work through the questions I gave you, let me just turn it over to you. What are some of the things questions that you ended up with after reading through and the gospel? Really about anything, any of the chapters that we've talked about. Okay,
At
one
the
question.
end, when Jesus dies, it says the centurion says, certainly this man was innocent. Why did he come to that?
Okay, so question about chapter 23, verse 47. Now, when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. He's the second one because the thief on the cross said this man is innocent. It's not really explained. I mean, do you have any hunch yourself as to how he could do? I mean, how do you tell innocence from the way that someone dies? Is it because?
Is it just because he's so enduring?
You know, the someone's attitude in death does often disclose something about their character. Now we know that many criminals, I mean, like the old story is, the prisons are filled with innocent men, that there are many people who have been convicted of crimes they claim to be innocent. It's not really explained. I think it's kind of an open question, but there was something about his demeanor that, how about Jesus saying from the cross, this is in Luke, Father, forgive them, meaning the people who crucified them, for they know not what they do. Now that's a very extraordinary statement. If someone is guilty, has been convicted, such a person may feel great bitterness at receiving punishment, even if it's a punishment that in some sense has been merited. And so Jesus' attitude of, forgive them, they know not what they do, that may, and the whole, I think it was probably the whole cumulative impact of the way that Jesus endured his suffering. Any other questions? Anyone online have a question to pose?
I have a question. You can go ahead.
I just have like a basic question. Are the questions that we completed, are those just completion or are those graded?
Oh no, that's a credit, no credit. So if you've done them, you'll get credit. But
Okay.
but many of these themes, see, we're gonna start next class period, and we're gonna fill in a lot more of the historical background and so on. So we're getting a sense of the narrative flow overall, and a lot of these questions you've answered: kingdom of God, the healing of the sick, the calling of the apostles. We're gonna keep coming back to those. So those questions are kind of, I mean, they're on Luke specifically, but we're going to talk about some of those themes in greater depth.
Okay, and when's the new due date for the Credo?
Oh, that you could just turn that in on Sunday, and I'll give you some guidance. I'll get you an email later today so you can work on that.
All right, thank you.
Shouldn't take you too long. Any other questions?
I just had a quick question about in Luke chapter 23. I couldn't really figure out where the turning point was, where the crowd like suddenly turns against Jesus, and even after Pilate keeps asking, like, he's done nothing wrong, like, why do you want me to punish him? And they just are like rabid and they won't let him go. So I wasn't able to tell like why they felt that way.
Okay, if you compare the other gospels, and I actually don't remember, it's either Matthew, I think it's in Matthew, that it says that the crowd had been paid off, that they actually bribed some people to stir up the crowd. I mean, you'd think that they would be asking for Jesus rather than crying, Barabbas, Barabbas, give us Barabbas. I suppose Barabbas had a few companions in rebellion, against Rome, some other dagger men, if he was one of these dagger men. But it's a striking thing that the crowd as a whole begins to tilt in that particular direction. Let me see if I can find the reference. It says, Okay, so let's see. No, it's not in Matthew. Maybe it's in. Oh man, I should know the reference, but it may be in Mark. But in one of the Gospels, it does say that there would have been some bribery in order to get a certain thing, get a certain opinion to be expressed. So crowd psychology, mob psychology is a kind of strange thing to understand. Because sometimes if you have a small group of determined people, they can tilt a whole group of people that are already agitated in a particular direction. And we see this during revolutionary movements. I'm tempted to make political applications today. I think I will forbear from doing that. But whole groups of people can sometimes act in ways that are fairly unpredictable. I think this happened during like the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. You know, the Bolsheviks in Russia, they were a small minority, but they were able to mobilize a much larger group. Zoe, comment? Further comment? Okay, I thought you had another
Oh
question.
no, that's all. Thank you.
One last question. Anybody? All right. Well, enjoy the further readings, and you'll get to watch some video clips as well. If you want to review the Gospel of Luke, remember you have that Jesus movie, which is just the Gospel of Luke verbatim. If you haven't watched that, so that's a kind of a painless way to refresh your memory of the overall story of the third Gospel. So, okay, I'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you.